It's Travis Wayne Goodsell, and I'm finally able to get to the second coming for Christians. I'll have to word it differently because Christians won't catch on to Messiah. They only recognize Christ, even though they're the exact same word, just in a different language. The one thing that troubles me about Christians is their ignorance. They believe the Bible to be the Word of God, and they refuse to accept any new scriptures that have been discovered. The Gnostic Gospels, the Hammurabi texts, the Book of Thomas, Book of Judas, the Gospel of Peter. And I've talked about this on another video about Peter. If Christians believe that Peter took over the church after Christ was murdered, why then is his gospel not in the Bible, the New Testament? That's the big one. I mean, why are you guys pushing for Paul's writings? He was just a regular apostle. He wasn't a 12. He had no authority. And so, you know, that's what people have to deal with Christians, is their complete ignorance of how the scriptures came to be, and their full blind devotion to a lie, in essence. They don't want to claim Catholicism, and yet they cling to everything that Catholicism gave them. Christmas, Sabbath day, and Easter, and the New Testament. So that's a bizarre hypocrisy that I can't quite figure out. Okay, so with the second coming, using the same theme, let me refresh your memory if you haven't been paying attention to the other the Jewish scriptures and traditions and texts. There is an overarching theme in the Old Testament, and Christians believe in the Bible. They'll tout the Ten Commandments, but anything else they really don't give much credence to, yet they still contain the Old Testament as part of their Bible. There are some Christian groups that only do the New Testament, but yeah, people still cling to the Ten Commandments, even though the New Testament, Jesus says, love God, love your neighbor, is now the overarching law, which is what exactly Moses said in Deuteronomy. So that's all that was a quoting of the Torah. The overarching theme of the whole Bible is that of a good and righteous king usurped by a brother, and the kingdom falling into disrepair and apostasy and corruption and wickedness. And as a result, later on down the line comes a descendant who restores the kingdom. That's the overarching theme in the Bible. So you have Cain and Abel. Abel is murdered. Along comes Noah later on, when the world is wicked. So that's simply put. And I bring up Noah because Noah is mentioned of in Matthew 24. along with the signs of the second coming. And so Jesus is merely following this pattern. The Jews do not recognize Jesus as being the last days Messiah. They don't recognize him as the father who is murdered either, and his kingdom usurped. So that's something that the Jews apparently do not even understand in their own scripture, their own Torah. That pattern that I brought up in my videos. So, but that's who Jesus was. In the end, he died. He did not establish the kingdom on earth. And so his prayer, which Catholics primarily use it, but I'm sure Christians are aware of it, the Lord's Prayer, "Thy kingdom come." That has to do with the earthly kingdom, the last days kingdom, because it has nothing to do with the heavenly kingdom, because Jesus is there. He established the heavenly kingdom already. He's waiting for people to follow the religious rituals that he had set up so that people can return to the heavenly kingdom. But when you do not have a church organization with the rituals, you can't get back, because you need a restoration to occur. And Christians, they don't understand that. Christians do not have a leader. Catholics have a leader, the Pope, which is just a lowly bishop. Because when Jesus and the 12 were murdered, apparently apostles didn't take over. It was bishops who were in charge of their own congregations. And the Catholic Church no longer has a bishop in charge of a congregation. That's a pastor now, I guess. And the position of Pope got elevated to the position of Jesus, the Vicar of God. And so Christians do not believe in that process. That's why you guys separated. You don't associate it with Catholicism. And so as a result, you have no leader. Evangelicals have popular pastors, televangelists, but there is no one leader for all Christians. And again, if you have no leader, who do you follow? You know, you claim the Bible, but I just told you in the beginning that it's the Catholics' version of the Bible. They withheld documents. They withheld information. They suppressed what should have been more authoritative than Paul's writings. And so, you know, it's difficult, because I grew up born and raised Mormon, so I am able to speak to Mormons better than I am to Christians, better than I am to Jews, even though I understand the Bible of the Jews and the Bible of the Christians better than Jews and Christians do. I did not grow up with your mindset, and it doesn't make sense to me. It's not logical. And for example, you believe in faith with no works. You don't have to do anything. You just have to believe. And you know that's not true, because you don't want to be cheated by somebody. You don't want somebody stealing from you. And you know that you don't steal from others. You don't murder people. You don't commit adultery, ruin your family. You know those things. Those are works. And so I don't understand why you guys are so easily fooled into thinking that faith alone in the Catholic Bible is good enough to save you, when you know you have to do works. Just like James says, faith without works is dead. And it's not just action. You know, people come up with, oh, you can't just talk the talk, you've got to walk the walk. No, you can't do that. You have to get to the destination, using the metaphor. When you get an idea in your head, if you're an architect, for example, that's the simplest, easiest for me to explain. An architect gets an idea, revelation, inspiration, whatever you want to call it, in his head. And he doesn't just say, you know, hey, okay, contractors, build what my thoughts are. They're going to look at you and go, yeah, whatever, get out of here. You need blueprints. You've actually got to work. You've got to put the idea in your head on paper, in a blueprint. That's how the scriptures were written. People had ideas, they wrote them down. For us, we now have those blueprints that the prophets from long ago wrote. And so we're the contractors. We're the ones who take the blueprints and build what the blueprints tell us to build. And if we build it, we then will know, no longer having faith, we now know that the blueprint is good or bad, or where it has faults, weaknesses. Just like a contractor, if they are 100% accurate in building it exactly as the blueprint tells them to, because if the contractors don't follow the blueprint, they're not going to get the results that the blueprint is supposed to give them. You have to be 100% obedient, we'll use the religious word there, to the blueprint. And if you find out that there's something wrong in the plans, you go back to the architect and you say, hey, there's a problem here. You don't have a support beam in this area of the house, for example. The building will collapse. And so any religion, can you do the same process? They have to do the process. It's ridiculous to just cling to the scriptures, hold it close to your body, and go, I feel this is true. I feel it with every fiber of my being. And I refuse to allow anybody to tell me there's something wrong with it. Again, have you replicated the blueprint of the Bible, the New Testament, the Gospels? Because if you have, you will learn, as I've learned, that there are mistakes, that there are missing information, missing parts of the blueprint. It's not a complete building. More information needs to be put in it. But you're never going to know if you don't try to replicate it. If you just claim faith in it and draw near to the Lord and to other people claiming the Bible is the Word of God, and yet you've never replicated it, then guess what you're doing? Remember the 10 Commandments? Thou shalt not bear false witness. You're lying. There's some good things in the Bible, don't get me wrong, but it's incomplete and there are some errors. And so those who believe in the infallibility of the Bible, you've never even bothered to try to reconstruct it, what it says. And it's difficult to talk to people who refuse to understand this concept. When people go about their normal lives, working in jobs, there are architects, most likely, who still believe in the infallibility of the Bible. There are scientists, doctors, lawyers. And yet, they live two separate lives. In their real life with their jobs, they follow that pattern of replicating blueprints in whatever field you're in. But then when it comes to church and the Bible, you don't even bother. You don't even try. And that, I don't understand it. It doesn't make sense to me. I understand why those in power and control who created the blueprints in error and incomplete, I know why they did it. Because they're covering things up. They're purposely deceiving us. They're lying to us in order to control us. To keep us from learning the truth. And such is the case with the story of Jesus in the Gospels. There's only 4 Gospels that the Catholics accepted into the New Testament. And, I'm sort of stuck because there's extra information in other scriptures that were banned by the Catholics. There's the Gospel of Mary, the mother of Jesus. It tells about her life. And it baffles me that Catholics would ban this when they've elevated Mary to almost goddess stature. The mother of Jesus, the holiest of holy women. And they won't even allow the gospel attributed to her and her life. Catholics are suppressing her history. Now, granted, it is not directly her journal entry, so to speak. It was written at least several hundred years later. And so the person who wrote it just titled it The Gospel of Mary. But that's the same with every book in the Bible. The original authors are not the ones that the Bible attributes. That's part of the deception. And so, unless Christians are rebellious, like I was rebellious in Mormonism, for example, in our Doctrine and Covenants, it talks about the Apocrypha. But we don't have the Apocrypha in our Old Testament. The leaders of our church have denied putting the Apocrypha in, even though the founder of our organization said, hey, it doesn't need to be retranslated, it's perfectly fine as it is, and people can get wisdom and understanding from them. So don't get me wrong, I was born and raised Mormon, but I've seen through the lies of our organization. And I hope, Christians, that you will see the lies and deception through your religions, because you have hundreds. I mean, you guys are shattered. You know, taking Daniel's dream, I mean, you guys are the shattered clay feet. You have no leader. You have nobody to guide you. And you have an incomplete and incorrect text. And so it's difficult to communicate with those who don't have this basic understanding about their religious text. Because if I were to just start talking about how Jesus is a symbol of Osiris in this one instance, but he's the symbol of Horus in this other instance, you guys wouldn't have a clue, and you'd say fake news, lock him up, because the majority of you voted for Trump, so I know you're alt-right conservative. So I know that part of you, because Mormons are alt-right conservative. I grew up in an alt-right conservative family. That's why I'm the rebellious one in the family and in the church. Because I learned truth. And I exposed the lies in the family and in the church. The question is, why can't you guys do it? And I guess it's for the same reason why the remaining members of the Mormon Church still cling to Mormonism and refuse to go outside of their additional scriptures. So Mormons do it too. They've added scriptures, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, but that's as far as they go now. Since Joseph Smith died, we don't add any more. You know, we don't have the Apocrypha, even though our founders said, hey, it's good, read it, you'll get inspired from it. See, when I read that in the Doctrine and Covenants, I wanted to find out, what are the apocryphal scriptures? Our topical guide that we have in the back of our Bible, it gives a listing of each of the books of the Apocrypha. And interestingly enough, my dad was somewhat of a rebel, and he had a Catholic Bible that has the Apocrypha, so I was able to read it. I had to sneak into the den as a kid to secretly read it. Because we were, as kids, sort of banned from the den, but yet also encouraged to go in the den and read. Sort of a contradiction there in the family. Having contact problems. But yeah, Bel. That's my favorite story in the Apocrypha. Probably out of all scriptures. It's part of the addition to the book of Daniel. There's Bel, and then there's the dragon. That's a different story. I like Bel. Personal favorite. But if I had been a Mormon zealot, I would never have known about Bel. And then it would never have been my favorite scripture, my favorite story. So for a religion to anathematize, as Catholics call it, or ban and censor any book that's not contained in the Catholic New Testament, that's an immediate red flag for me. And I don't like being placed in that situation. I don't like being denied knowledge. I don't like being told that something is bad, therefore I must stay away. I want to know why it's bad. And so as a child, there was that little fear in me by my religious leaders and parents to stay away from certain things, from certain literature. Because alt-right conservative religion and parents, they're all for banning books, burning books, censoring information, keeping things secret. That's what the LDS Church is all about, keeping secrets. When you go in for a bishop's interview, it used to be done all in secret. No recordings, no witnesses, just you and a bishop. And of course there's many scandals in the church as a result of those secrets, those cover-ups. It's a religion. You know, there's no secrets in a religion. And so it doesn't make sense to me why the leaders of the Mormon Church meet in secret, don't want things recorded, don't want people to know what's going on, because that sends up red flags. It says, hey, what's going on? This is just a religion. You know, we're not forming a coup against the government. We're not going to war against another country. Why are you having secrets? And then they give us the fear. Oh, Lucifer inspires people to destroy the church. Well, no wonder. You're keeping secrets. People want to know what you're keeping secret. That's the only reason why they sneak in audio devices, recording devices. That's why the temple endowment is on YouTube and online, because you've kept it a secret from everybody. And you try to claim, oh, it's sacred. But it's not, is it? It's a secret. And you tell Mormons that we're supposed to keep it secret from the world. And why? Because Mormons believe that if they reveal what happens in the temple, that then other people will know how to get into the Mormon heaven, in which they call it the celestial kingdom rather than heaven. And so for your pastors or your religious evangelists or whoever you title your leaders in your congregations, for them to withhold information from you, to tell you bad things about a newly discovered ancient text, classical text technically, you know, like the Book of Thomas. When that came out, oh boy, did they try to cover that up. That was earth-shaking for the Catholics. Because people were looking at it and going, hey, it sort of says we don't need a building to worship God. So I guess that means no organized religion. And that's why people are now talking about, oh, I don't believe in organized religion. It's because of the Gospel of Thomas that got out. People took it out of context. They liked the one passage taken out of context and have now created a whole life. But like I told you near the beginning, Jesus died giving the rituals path. And it requires a temple. And yet the temple's gone. But where's the leader to rebuild the temple? Ezekiel says there will be a temple built by the King of the world. But if you don't believe in the Bible, the Old Testament, you're not going to believe Ezekiel, even though Ezekiel is talking directly to the house of Israel. Christians, you are the house of Israel. Ezekiel's talking to you guys. And yet you go after Daniel instead, because that corresponds with John the Revelator, as you suppose. But if you've been watching my other videos, you know that Daniel talks also about the Messiah Prince. Not the Messiah King, who is Jesus. The Messiah Prince. That's the pattern. So, 30 minutes. Have I explained the whole introduction for you guys? Or am I still going to have to handle comments of disbelievers who are trying to silence me, trying to demonstrate by being un-Christ-like how I'm wrong? Okay, so with what we have, you know, I guess I'll just go over the New Testament and the New Testament alone. And so I won't bring in extra scriptures because you guys don't believe in that. I don't know if I could come up with enough for a full video presentation with the other extra stuff, but it doesn't matter. We'll do with what we got. So Matthew, kata. It was the creation of these Gospels that changed the Greek definition of kata to mean according to. And so Catholic then became translated as according to the whole, Cataholic. And so according to Matthew doesn't mean Testament of Matthew, it means according to Matthew. Originally, it meant downward motion of the whole, a downward motion. Sort of like in cathode, scientific terminology. They used that definition, that original definition. And so Catholic, technically in the original definitions, means the downward motion of the whole. Kind of a fun joke that I've caught on to as when I was studying Greek. Yeah, Thomas Robinson, our teacher, didn't want to explain the conflict of definitions. He refused to do that. Good times. Okay, so Matthew, I can only sum it up for you guys. Just point out some of the things that's going on, because I've already summed it up. Jesus is the one who dies. He is the Father. He is not the Son, who is supposed to come in the latter days. So there is no second coming. It's a different kind of coming. It's the coming of the Son of Jesus. So there, that's the video. That's why I had to do the introduction. so that you can understand why I would say such a thing. Because Matthew is trying to say, hey, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah of the last days. And that's not the case. Just like in Mormonism, Joseph Smith originally thought, hey, I'm the last days Jewish Messiah. And that's why they have Elijah appearing to Joseph Smith in their Kirtland Temple. Is because, he thought he was it. Restoring the Church of Jesus. But then he was murdered. He ended up in the same symbolism as Jesus. And so when I get to Mormons, I'll be telling them, sorry, it's not one of the prophets who will just get in because of the death of a previous prophet. That's not how it works. And so with you guys as well, there is no second coming, but there is a coming of the Prince of Jesus, the Messiah Prince. Jesus is the Messiah King. He's already established his kingdom in heaven. And he has set the path, the ritual path, to return to his kingdom in heaven. But there needs to be a kingdom on earth established by his Son, restored by his Son, in order to have those rituals to get to the kingdom of heaven where Jesus is. And this is all new for you guys, I understand. But Matthew was trying to claim that the prophecies of the Old Testament were being fulfilled with Jesus. And he's partially right, because Jesus fulfilled the Father original king figure who was murdered. But he throws in a lot of the Son symbolisms also. And that's why we have the birth of Jesus. But we know there's errors, and because of the timing. Herod died before 1 AD. If you honestly believe that AD represents, after the birth of Christ. Even though I thought, oh, maybe it means after death as a little kid, No, it's Anno Domini, the Latin phrase. But and BC was supposed to be before Christ. So, no, he was not born in 1 AD. And he wasn't born during the time of Herod. But you have to do your research. You have to look at all the other scriptures in the Old Testament, in the Apocrypha, in the Pseudepigrapha, which are wrongly titled Pseudepigrapha, because pseudo means fake or false. And, that's why I'm saying that psychiatry is a pseudoscience. It's a fake science. They don't use the measurements that real hard scientists use. But of course, under Trump, there is no science anymore. And he's laid off, fired, numerous scientists working for the government. And so that's a simple concept of it. The whole Jesus as the title of Christ, that just means he was anointed. But again, he died. So yes, he was anointed as king, but he died. The Son will be anointed. He will restore Jesus' kingdom here on earth. So if you get stuck on only one Christ in all of history, then you deceive yourself. Because who is David? David is a Christ. He was anointed king. That's why Matthew is trying to tell us that Jesus is descended from King David. And that's the genealogy, is to try to show, hey, Jesus is the legitimate heir to the throne. Because see, we created a genealogy listing of those who were heirs to the throne of King David. That's what Matthew, or the author of Matthew, is trying to do. Trying to show that Jesus is legitimate. But it's all made up. And yeah, generation. This is the book of the generation of Jesus Christ. You know, there's the debate of gender versus sex. And people try to say, no, gender is not the sex identification. What do you think the word gen means in gender? You know, I love Samantha Bee. I love her show, Full Frontal, on TBS. You know, I love that she covers the topics that nobody else is covering in the news, and sticking up for the oppressed and the abused throughout the world, not just in our country. But come on. Gender. Come on, people. Gen. Gen is like in genealogy. Generations. It's a result of the sexual union between man and woman. Genealogy. You know, who are my biological parents? The parents who had sex that had me. And then so on. The parents that had sex and had my parents. All the way back. As far back as I can go. That's genealogy. You know, it's not about your adopted parents. That's their genealogy. That's not my genealogy, if I had adopted parents. You know, if I had a gay couple raising me, they're not my parents. They're not my they're not part of my generation. They did not conceive and bear me. So when we talk about gender, we're talking about sexual identity. So when it says that we're not supposed to discriminate on the basis of sex, it's also referring to gender. And I did another video about this, and I don't want to dwell on this because I'm supposed to be talking about the symbolisms of the Messiah, the last days Messiah Prince, the Christ Prince. I just wanted to get that out there. So you can't change definitions and expect everybody to accept your changed definition of things. I wish people would stop that. But we need to stop the abuse so that people don't want to be somebody they're not. Because that's why people are who they're not, is because there's abuse going on. We need to stop the abuse. Okay, so Matthew is trying to set up Jesus in the first chapter as being the Son Christ, David as the Father Christ, and thus Jesus, being the son of David, is therefore the rightful heir to the throne to restore the kingdom of David and be the king, the Father King, basically. But he died. And so his restoration attempt failed. But as I told you, it's there in heaven waiting for us. We just need a restored kingdom here on earth in order to have the rituals necessary to get back to his kingdom. And so that's part of the confusion here, is that it starts off with Jesus as the Son King, the Son Christ, and then ends with Jesus instead being the Father Christ, because he's dead. Emmanuel. That's the name of the Egyptian god, people. It is the New Testament that changed the definitions for the Hebrews when the Jews finally got together in 800 AD to write out their Bible, putting in vowels, because the original Hebrew didn't have vowels, and they conformed it to the Greek text for the most part. There are some differences, but it was this later change in definition to say God with us, and that's not the correct translation. The original translation is the god Amun, which is an Egyptian god, a sun god. So when you get into Luke and Jesus is the son of the highest what? It's an adjective, but there's no noun for the adjective to describe. And if you go to the Greek, the translation is highest sun, as in sun up in the heaven, the sky right now, that the earth rotates around. And so Jesus is the sun god. He is the son of the sun god. Thus, Isaiah called him Emmanuel, the god Emmanuel, Amen. And if you go into the Egyptians, which I will in the next video series, I guess, I'll show you exactly how this is Egyptian. And so again, it's pointing out the author's intention here is to show that he is the last days Messiah at the first, or the last days Christ at first, and then at the end he's saying, oh no, he's the first Christ. And thus Jews say, yeah, okay, he failed. He's not the last days Christ like you claim he was. And that's why Jews don't believe in Jesus. But it's sad that Christians don't believe in the last days Christ. They only believe in Jesus. And he died. He failed to establish the kingdom on earth because it was usurped. Just as Jacob means the usurper. He usurped the birthright and blessing from Esau. Okay, but then, even though Jesus was born in the house of bread, that's Bethlehem, of Judea, which is Judah, in the days of Herod, the king. See, here they're setting it up. They're having the usurper king as King Herod. That the Roman Empire was the usurpers. And that is the whole setting that is being set up here by Matthew. And so there needs to be a restoring Christ who needs to take back the kingdom from Herod. That's what the Jews were waiting for. That's what the Jews were hoping for back then. And so here we have, Jesus was born. A child is born. Unto us a child is born. You know, Isaiah. And the government shall be upon his shoulders. And it wasn't. Jesus never took possession of the government. He never overcame Herod. But that's the intention here, and he's merged the two Christs into one narrative. He messed up the text. And so if, Jesus obviously didn't restore the kingdom on earth, and so he needs to keep the narrative only about him as the one to die, to have his kingdom usurped, and leave out all of the stuff about him being the last days Messiah. And he fails on that respect. And then we have the wise men, which has been traditionalized as the three wise men, and that they then claim, oh, that's because of the three stars in the belt of Orion that point to the star Sirius. And if you understand Egyptian, Orion is the King Christ in the Egyptian concept, and Sirius is the star who is the Sun Christ. And thus the three stars at the belt point down to the Sun Christ. That's where this concept came from. It's from the Egyptians. And here's what they say when they get there. Where is he that is born King of the Jews? He failed. He died. So again, they're trying to attach him as the last days Christ rather than the murdered Christ. And then they throw in a star in the east. They are in the east, they see the star further east, and then go west. Yeah, this was a sign that they were seeing. There was no star above the little shack that Jesus, the baby Jesus, was in. That's not what is meant here. It means there was a sign in the heavens, and these wise men recognized the sign as being the time. And I've done a video on it. I've done a book on it. I've done posts on it on my website. So if you are still listening to my video and are still kind of curious as to what I'm talking about, because your Christian perception still doesn't quite comprehend everything I'm trying to tell you, and it's available for you to find out. And oh man, I have to use this light so that you can see my face, because if I turn it off you won't see me, but the light is blinding me. That's why I can't be an actor or a person on Broadway. It's because lights are too bright. Makeup. Ugh. When you're watching a movie and you can tell from the lips of the male actors, they're wearing lipstick, aren't they? There's something off color on their lips. You'd think with the high definition we wouldn't need lipstick anymore on our actors. Alright. And Herod, when he hears about this, he's troubled, because he knows his time is up. He's going to be replaced by this Jesus, the Son Messiah, the Son King, or the Son Christ. And so he gathers his chief priests and scribes. Where is this Christ who should be born? Oh, well, it's prophesied it's supposed to be in Bethlehem, the house of bread. Never mind that it has to do with the constellations in the skies, the sign in the heavens. And unfortunately, looking at my stellarium, the sign that John the Revelator talks about where the house of bread star is in the constellation of Virgo, the woman who is to give birth to the last days Christ, the man-child as he calls him, didn't happen back then. So what this is actually doing is giving us prophecy for the last days Christ, not Jesus Christ. Jesus had a different sign, and it was up over Moscow, of all places. So it was only a partial over Jerusalem. But you'd have to go back to my other stuff to learn about that. And so, yeah, Herod, of course, wants to then kill babies. And we need to find out and kill this Jesus. And that's just rehashing older stories, mixing it in with this. Because he's trying to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of the past prophecies, and he's mixing things together, not fully understanding that there are two separate prophecies that he's mixing up here. And then gold, frankincense, and myrrh, that's all temple stuff. That's what you anoint a king with, frankincense and myrrh. And the king receives gold as tribute. Okay. And yeah, there's even a part about them going into Egypt. And Joseph having a dream and being warned of God takes Jesus into Egypt. Not a coincidence that it's Egypt. So he grows up learning Egyptian. There ended up being the Alexandrian Christians that were the most numerous of Christians when Jesus and the apostles were dead. And they posed a threat to the other churches because being more numerous in membership, that posed a threat to the other congregations who wanted to impose their doctrines, their gospel, etc. And I talk about that in my apostasy book. And probably the apostasy, I think I did a video on it too. And there's blog posts that I've done it on. Alright, so that's basically it. And that we have a mixture for Jesus of what of that he was supposed to be the one to be murdered rather than establish the kingdom of God on earth. That is to be a future last days person, not Jesus. And so that's pretty much it. So we'll take you to the last days signs. You know them: sun, moon, stars. So how do you know when the sun, moon, stars are? Well, you need some kind of a timeline, a dating. And so John the Revelator was brilliant on that, and I showed you in Matthew of what that was, how John got it, and that's of the constellation Virgo in chapter 12. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven. It's a sign in the heavens. A woman in the constellation Virgo, clothed with the sun. The sun is in Virgo during the September month. Not exactly September, it goes plus and minus, whatever, but September is usually the when the sun is in Virgo. So it's going to be in September in the future. And that's obviously every year. So how do we know? Well, we got to throw in more signs that accompany this to pinpoint the exact date in the future from any other date plus or minus the time period he's writing this. Okay, the moon under her feet. It does not say a full moon. It does not say a new moon. It just says the moon. And so that happens once a year as well. Probably a couple of times, actually. I don't know. Maybe not. But yeah, it coincides with the sun, so it narrows it down to a specific date in the month of September. But it still is unclear, because it's year by year. The moon will always appear at the foot of Virgo when the sun is there in September. And the date just changes from year to year, the day. Okay, but here we go. Here's the distinctive one. And upon her head is the constellation Leo. And Leo anciently had only 9 stars. It obviously has billions upon billions in every little section of the constellation. That's not how the ancients saw it. They utilized the brightest stars to form the picture of the constellation Leo. And there were only 9. So what John is saying here is that 3 additional moving stars, planets, will be in the constellation of Leo in September on the day when the moon is at her feet. Now we have a definitive date in the future. And it has never happened before, and it will never happen again, but it happened on the 23rd of September 2017. And if you were paying attention to YouTube during that time, you would have seen a lot of people talking about it. That's how I found out about it. And that's when it happened. That is the coming of the Son Christ, the last days Christ. And this is who the baby representations of Jesus are supposed to apply to, is this person in these latter days. In our days, 2017 was just last year. And then there are other signs here, and I've already pinpointed those. I haven't heard anybody else talk about them, but I've got them, published them, blogged them, videoed them. So if you're still listening and you're wanting to know more, they're out there for you. And so yeah, this is it. So guess what that means? Guess who the Herod is for the last days Christ? Trump. And how do we know this? Why can't it be the Pope? Why can't it be the King of England or the Queen of England? Where did the solar eclipse happen? Do you see? The sun and moon stars. They happened during this time period when these stars in John, these dates occurred. 21st of August, 2017. A rare total solar eclipse over the whole United States. The next one will be in 2024 on April 8th. On April 8th, 4 AD, is when the total solar eclipse happened over Moscow, Russia. It wasn't Russia back then. It started over in Netherlands, Finland, that area, and then it carried over. So Moscow was in the path of the eclipse, just as the whole United States was in the path of our eclipse. 2020 years later, an eclipse will occur. But over the United States, just the eastern portion, and it'll go this way rather than this way. And it'll cross in the southern part of Iowa, or Illinois. Okay, so there you have it. And that's a precise date given to us by John. All the guys doing videos on this were correct. They just didn't understand that it had to do with the man-child, who is to be the last days Christ, the second coming of Christ. That was the day. He's here. You just have to do your research now to figure out, who is he? How do I know who he is? And I've already done it for the Jews. Because the Christian information is not very good. It only says repeats of some of what the Old Testament says about him. So you've got to learn what the Jews know about him, because they're more expert on the last days Messiah than you are on the second coming of Christ. Even though John the Revelator has quite a lot to say about other things going on, about the Bush War in the Middle East and the tanks that were used over there, and the Trump's sign on the forehead, the image of Trump being in Hebrew numbers the count of 666, and his image speaking blasphemies as he gives rallies on a TV screen, his image. John was seeing all of this. He knew. Because we know it's Trump, because we know the date. John gave us the future date. So we know that the solar eclipse over the United States is the sun sign. Sun shall be darkened. That means it's Trump. Trump was put in 2017. And when you have a corrupt government, you need a Christ to save the world, save the people from the government of corruption. That's the whole Exodus story. And Jeremiah 23, it talks about the last days Messiah who will be like Moses. Because no more will the people talk about Moses in the Exodus. He says in Jeremiah, they will now talk about the last days Messiah Moses. Moses is a symbol. And here we have it here. In verse 5, and she brought forth a man-child, and it's actually translated male child, not a man-child. It's not a grown man, even though he is a grown man, because this is when he goes to try to restore the kingdom. And he can't do it alone. You know, look at Noah. He did it alone. He was the only one to survive with his kids. Out of the whole civilization, only Noah survived. You guys don't want to die, do you? Because the last days Messiah will live on. He'll survive. Because Ezekiel 17 says he will be low of stature. You guys won't know him. He's not Obama. He's not some great orator, some great politician, some great leader of business community or of government or of religion. He's low of stature. It's the greatest coup that God ever made on earth. It's awesome. But yeah, he'll be the one to rule all nations. That who is low of stature will be the greatest of all in the last days. And a rod of iron, that's a symbol. And this part, her child was caught up unto God and to his throne, that's a stellar sign also. That's a specific date in the future. And we know the date because we know the other signs. So when you know the interpretations that the ancients had for the constellations, you just track which planet is in the womb of Virgo last September, who emerged finally, because he was conceived, metaphorically speaking, just after the presidential election, during the supermoon in November, and was in the womb of Virgo for 10 months. It was an extended pregnancy. And that's usually what happens on the first child. It's extended because the woman's womb is not used to putting out babies. It's the first one. So the first baby is oftentimes a little longer than the others. And so, it's all right here in Scripture. See, the sign of the dragon, you'd have to know Judaic traditions, because it occurred on Hanukkah, on a specific day in Hanukkah, and I've already talked about that for the Jews. So I hope you guys understand how this all works. When you know the date, which we do thanks to John, and the book of Revelations almost didn't make it. The Catholics didn't like it because it was apocalyptic. It talked about a future. We already had Jesus. We don't need this book. But it got in. And as a result, we now know the date. And it happened. He's here. It's on earth. And he's not half God, half man. He's full man. And the Jews know that. But Christians, this is all new for you, isn't it? So, that's it in a nutshell. The story of Jesus in the Gospels is a mix of Jesus and the last days Christ. There is no second coming of Christ. There is only a restoring Son who brings back Christ's kingdom on earth, so that people can then get to Jesus' kingdom in heaven. That's the Christian understanding of the New Testament. That's what the whole book is trying to tell us. But they messed up big time. So there you go. There's the Christian version. So the next video will be about the Egyptian connections. I will tie in all of this, because John the Revelator throws in Egyptian stuff. All of the Gospels, Egyptian stuff. All of the Old Testament originates from the Egyptian. That's where this all comes from. That's who's the original religion. That's the kingdom that needs to be restored. Because the 18th dynasty, I've already discussed it in other videos, blogs, and books. The 18th dynasty, Egyptologists pronounce as the Thutmose dynasty. It's phonetically equivalent in Hebrew to the David-Moses dynasty. David, the king of David, the King David, the kingdom of David. Moses, 18th dynasty Egypt. That's the origin of the house of Israel. It's not the Hyksos. 18th dynasty. That's the kingdom that needs to be restored. And they had all the Gospels, all the information from the Gospels in their documents. And when you understand that Christ simply means one who is anointed, it's that simple. So yeah, we'll go on from here.